Wouldst thou like to live deliciously? Wouldst thou like to experience a masterpiece of Type 2 art? Wouldst thou like to invest $4 million in a first-time filmmaker and lead actress and make $40 million back? In this episode, we will analyze Robert Eggers' The Witch, a supernatural horror film from 2015, and I will attempt to answer those questions. Understanding is useful, so here we go. I'm Carl King, and this is The Carl King Show, where we learn about music, filmmaking, and creativity. If you like this show, head over to patreon.com/Carl King and join for just $1 or $5 per month. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my Illusionist $51 level patrons, Hank Howard III, Sean Motley, and Chubode. Quick shout out to my music endorsements, Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ball Strings, Tune Track, and Millennia Media. Now, let's get this episode beginned. Very good friends of Carl King, this is a brand new season of the show. I'm considering it season 3, and I intend to focus it on horror films because that's where a lot of Type 2 art is being made. Speaking of horror, or at least spooky stuff, I recently recorded a cover of the Munsters TV show theme in a more metal-ish style. Here it is. Wow. If you like the idea of me making music, I'm recording 2 new albums right now, and you can find out more about those inside my Patreon. And now, let's move on to this week's analytical filmmaking analysis of the week. This week's analytical filmmaking analysis of the week is The Witch, a horror film written and directed by Robert Eggers in 2015. And he is, in my own totally subjective opinion, a master of cinematic language and what I call Type 2 filmmaking. Later on in this episode, I'll break down a handful of scenes and I will explain why. But first, some trivia. I was shocked to find this out. The Witch was Robert Eggers' feature directing debut. And at the same time, it was Anya Taylor-Joy's feature acting debut. That's right, neither of them had ever made a real movie before. But because of their incredible talent and skill, it was not a disaster. And it actually turned out to be a massive success. According to Wikipedia, the budget was $4 million, and it made over $40 million. And that's crazy because from an investor's standpoint, it's not easy to find an investment that will return 900% profit. That is, if I'm doing the math correctly. In comparison, money invested in the S&P 500 will make somewhere around 7 to 8% per year after inflation. And consider just how many films, even classics, actually lost money. So some executive out there made a dang good decision and let Robert Eggers make The Lighthouse and The Northman, and each of those films made less profit than the previous, and I recommend them both. And good news for all you vegan goth girls out there, Robert Eggers is releasing a new film on Christmas Day this year, that's 2024, about a guy named Nosferatu, who seems to be low on vitamin D. Now, all of Robert Eggers' films, including The Witch, are Type 2 works of art, and that means that they rank high in the dimensions of surprise, abstraction, ambiguity, subtlety, nonlinearity, ironic counterpoint / juxtaposition, and Dimension 7. And hey, number 8, a new one I just added, dissonance. This one should have been obvious to me earlier, because dissonance refers to things that are broken or out of balance, and our minds might want to fix them. And those can be visual, like a bizarre camera angle or a jarring cut, or it can be auditory, like a sound or a piece of music that feels wrong or uncomfortable. Back in episode 57 of the show, I explained the other 7 dimensions and defined the 2 types of art, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And as we go, we'll keep a tally on the screen. Those dimensions are ways of breaking the rules creatively, and it's often taken to an extreme. And that doesn't come naturally to most filmmakers. It's easy by default to do things according to norms, making films just like the films we saw before, and to not question that process. And when watching a Type 2 film, an inexperienced viewer might interpret a brave artistic choice as a person simply not knowing what he was doing. They might see a Dutch angle and wonder, why is the camera cockeyed? Well, a filmmaker like Robert Eggers is doing it all wrong on purpose and on an expert level. And that is what makes his films so powerful to those who enjoy Type 2 art. So here we go. First up, the most obvious question, what's going on with the spelling of The Witch? Because it's got 2 V's and it looks like the Vavitch. Now, why would witch be spelled with 2 V's? Well, this story is set in New England in the 1630s, and it follows some Puritans or Calvinists, or what we call pilgrims. They were ultra-religious European people. Now, if I understand the internet correctly, the letter W was invented by the 1630s, but it was not commonly used back then. It seems they did have crude printing presses by that time. And if they were short on W's, they'd just stick 2 V's together. Or in the case of this book from the 1690s, they'd spell witches with 2 U's. Now, if they did that more often with other letters, imagine how many more letters in the alphabet we might have today, like a double Q. How would that be pronounced? Let me know in the comments, or don't. Anyway, using 2 V's in the title of The Witch was an artsy, period-appropriate move, and I have to wonder if there was any debate about it, because officially, if you type The Witch into a search engine or IMDb, it's spelled with a W, not 2 V's, even though it is spelled with 2 V's on the movie poster and my copy of the Blu-ray. I would be curious to know, for historical vibe and authenticity, did Robert Eggers want The Witch to officially be spelled with 2 V's? And if so, it's likely the studio would have pushed back because it would confuse their customers. Unusual spellings are a commercial speed bump. If it were spelled the Vavitch, it would be difficult to look up showtimes at the theater or find the Blu-ray on Amazon, for example. And if most people will intuitively type your product's name wrong, you're taking a big risk. And if you do have a name with an unusual spelling, you know what a hassle it is to constantly correct people every day of your life. And if you think about it, The Witch is a super generic name. Imagine pitching that to a development executive, because it's not too clever, is it? The Witch? And there were already several films called The Witch. To avoid that problem myself, when I'm coming up with names for projects, I go to the opposite extreme and I complicate it. That is, aside from That Monster Show. Here are 3 examples of my overly complicated album titles. How to Sell the Whole Effing Universe to Everybody Once and For All, hero's ship or minimum of one planet must explode in first act, and 50 intellectually stimulating themes from a cheap amusement park for robots and aliens, Volume 1. So this film's very generic two-word title, along with Star Wars, which I've always thought is not a very good name, proves that the name doesn't matter as much as we think it does. But if this film had been a Type 1 work of art, it would have never been spelled with two V's, even on the poster. So I think it was a strong stylistic choice. And one last thing about that title. We assume the witch refers to the villain of the story, a scary witch who lives in the woods and terrorizes the family. But it turns out it's the protagonist, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, who at the end of the film signs a deal with Satan and becomes a witch herself. That's surprise number one. Spoiler alert. That's how that works, right? Now, let's reflect more on the time period in which this film is based. The film is subtitled A New England Folk Tale. And IMDb describes it like this. A family in 1630s New England is torn apart by the forces of witchcraft, black magic, and possession. A chilling portrait of a family unraveling within their own sins. So think about this. The 1630s is actually not too long after the Middle Ages. And that's important to remember because people didn't have very much science back then. Basically, these characters' fear of witches is normal. They expect witches to be out there in the woods, stealing babies, as much as modern campers expect bears to steal sandwiches. And of course, here we are nearly 400 years later, and plenty of people still believe in things that are far crazier. We project our fears onto the unknown, and that's exactly what these characters do with the woods near their farm. As in, don't go into the woods because obviously there are witches in there. That's just a fact of daily life for them. But they're not just superstitious, crazy people, because as it turns out, they are correct. There are witches in those woods. However, Robert Eggers leaves open to interpretation that the family might be hallucinating these mystical events due to malnutrition, social isolation, and their food being contaminated with a fungus called ergot. I would say that that is ambiguity number one. Now, let's talk about the creepy quote that fans of The Witch, like me, wear on their black t-shirts. Black Phillip, the family's goat, who lives on the farm and is kind of a jerk, seems to represent evil. It's kind of an earthly or pagan power of animals thing, which reminds me of The Donkey-Headed Adversary of Humanity by Sleepytime Gorilla Museum. So that's abstraction number one. And at the end of the film, he turns out to be Satan himself. And that's surprise number two. Dang, all this time it wasn't the witch they needed to fear. And after killing the rest of the family off, Black Phillip tempts Anya Taylor-Joy to join the dark side and whispers to her, "Wouldst thou like the taste of butter?" Now, why is Satan talking about butter? What's going on there? Well, it's not random. It's because in the 15th and 16th centuries, the Catholic Church declared that eating butter was a bigger sin than lying, blasphemy, or impurity. Why? We don't know yet. But obviously, she's gone a long time not eating butter, which to me is a dating green flag. Now, according to Robert Eggers, back during the Salem witch trials, Satan allegedly tempted Puritans with what seems to us trivial earthly pleasures, like a pair of shoes or an offer to do their chores. So Black Phillip continues tempting her with more than butter, like a pretty dress. Wouldst thou like to live deliciously? Now, I don't know what the term live deliciously comes from exactly, but it sure sounds satanic to me. And at the end of the film, before the credits, there's a notice that says, "This film was inspired by many folk tales, fairy tales, and written accounts of historical witchcraft, including journal entries, diaries, and court records. Much of the dialogue comes directly from period sources." Now, based on that, it's possible Robert Eggers found the two words Live Deliciously written somewhere on an old witchcraft pamphlet and just included them in the film. But I don't think he realized how much that tagline would catch on in the horror film community in the same way that I Have to Return Some Videotapes from American Psycho did. But it's socially useful when a cult film has a memorable line, because if you see someone wearing it on a shirt, you know, that person gets it. Now let's touch on the musical score composed by Mark Korven, who also scored Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse, but not The Northman. Why not? We don't know yet. He also scored another film, Cube, from 1997, which Modiak has been trying to get me to watch. Well, hello Dissonance number 1, because the music is minimalist, textural, noisy, and earthy. A lot of it consists of sounds humans can make without electronic instruments. There are ancient stringed instruments, including something called a Nyckel harpa, which is kind of medieval, and creepy percussion like sticks clicking together and spooky chanting. And again, it's very Sleepy Time Gorilla Museum. In fact, I stumbled on a video of Mr. Korven playing a homemade device known as the Apprehension engine, and the sounds coming out of it are totally unbelievable. It's a creepy wooden Ted Kaczynski kind of box with guitar necks and doodads sticking out of it, and he plays it with violin bows and an E-bow, and he taps on it with his hands, and even massages it with a rubber lollipop. And somehow it's entirely improvised. It looks like something that Dan Rathbun of Sleepy Time Gorilla Museum would build. Anyway, go watch it because I'm putting a link in the show notes. Now, finally, let's break down a few of the scenes. At the beginning of the film, there's the A24 logo and a bunch of black and white production company logos with no sound at all, not even hiss. And what follows is nearly 10 seconds of silence and blackness. We hear some sad strings, and it's a full 20 seconds of solid black before we see the film's title, The Witch, A New England Folktale. Now, why does this matter? Because this is Dimension 7, number 1. It's a deliberate and self-aware stretching of our attention and patience. It is very low energy. And if this were Type 1, like a movie made by Marvel, they would cold open with as big and explosive of a spectacle as they can. Probably two men fighting over something stupid, like which one should be at the top of the social dominance hierarchy. And Robert Eggers gives us a full minute of the opposite. And since films are a visual medium, our eyes expect to see something, not just nothing. Now think back to when you saw a film that used extended shots of nothing. Next time you see a cut to black, pay attention to how long it is. It's usually only a couple of seconds. But if you ever watched the TV series called Fargo, you might notice that Noah Hawley intentionally extends those gaps. It creates a lot of tension. So I always worry that the episode is over. But back to The Witch, at least in this case, sound is happening. There's another 7 seconds of sad string music with the solid black, and then scene 1 begins. Scene 1 is an exposition scene, which means it gives us the information we need to know to understand the story. But it's not delivered in an obvious way. The first shot is a close-up of Anya Taylor-Joy, just her hypnotic eyes staring. And that's dissonance number 2. While we hold on that same striking shot of Anya Taylor-Joy, her eyes, for 23 seconds, other characters in the room speak. And she looks a bit concerned, but doesn't move and doesn't even blink. Now, I tried staring for that long without blinking, but I couldn't do it. And it's important to notice that this same concept occurs later in the film in the second to last scene when another deal is made, which we will get to. Anyway, in this scene, a courtroom trial is taking place. The father, his wife, and 4 children are getting banished from the town. It turns out their religious fundamentalism is too extreme even for other Puritans to put up with. Now, if we were to grab our phone and record a video of something happening, our first intuitive move would be to point it at the person who is taking the main action or speaking. And that would be very type 1. But we could instead get creative with our shots like Robert Eggers did here. Throughout most of this nearly 3-minute scene, the camera is not pointed at the characters who are speaking. We get shots like the backs of the speakers' heads, or shots that are blurry, very far away, or partially occluded. And that's dissonance number 3. So instead of giving it to us directly, Robert Eggers creates mystery, and he creates curiosity. So when a filmmaker overtly hides something from the audience, like, I'm not showing you the person that's speaking, it makes us want to know more. And that's the necessary forward momentum in storytelling of any kind. It's actually similar to the mystery box concept talked about by J.J. Abrams in his TED Talk. And if you don't know what the heck that is, I'll put a link in the show notes. Another bit of trivia. The father in this film is played by an actor named Ralph Ineson. And you might know him as The Green Knight, which happened to be the film I used as the example in episode 57 when defining type 2 art. And coincidentally, that film has a very similar fairy tale or folk tale medieval vibe. And one last thing to consider in this scene, Anya Taylor-Joy plays the character as if she is observing the situation, but from an outsider's perspective. It's like she's smarter than those around her or aware that she doesn't belong in it, so she's dissociating, which she does throughout the film. The rest of the family members are stressed in one way or another because getting exiled from society is a big deal, but she is showing signs of being kind of disconnected or in another world and wanting a different life, and that pays off later. When the verdict is reached, her family walks away from the courtroom, but she stays standing there, still looking at the judges. So in that last shot, she's defiant, as if she feels nothing or doesn't relate. As the person who is kind of removed, she serves as the audience proxy, and that's the purpose of the main character, for the viewer to merge with them and to experience the story from their point of view. Moving on to scene 2, the family is riding away, leaving town with all of their stuff on a rickety wagon. And the first shot is partially occluded, and occluded means blocked or concealed. The camera looks out the back of the wagon as they ride away from town, and a gate shuts them out. Now notice there are 2 objects, which are people, in the extreme foreground. A type 1 approach would be making sure that everything is out of the way of the shot, so it would be cleaner and with less information for the viewer to process and decode. Like, hey, get out of the way of the camera, you dumbass. But type 2 cinematography, like this, tends to have a more conspicuous depth of field and more self-aware movement, or lack of movement. And that is dissonance number 4. And when the town's gate closes, we cut to the reverse, a medium shot as the wagon rides away from the camera, all loaded up Beverly Hillbillies style. Now notice that there's no dialogue at all in this scene. If this were a type 1, one of the kids would have said out loud, "Well, it sure sucks that we're getting banished from the town." And another kid would say, "Yeah, now our family is riding this wagon with all our junk out into the wilderness. How will we survive out there?" And the mom would say, "Now you two get some sleep. We have a long and dangerous journey ahead of us." Type 1 dialogue over-explains the plot, as if we're out in the kitchen getting a beer and can't see what's happening on the screen. But Robert Type 2 Eggers goes the opposite direction. Why say it when you can show it? And that is subtlety number 1. And the family sure doesn't look happy. They look bored as the wagon hobbles away slowly in the distance, struggling to get over the uneven ground. the camera drifts up to the sky as eerie droning music comes in, and that is dissonance number 5. And then the music swells and we get a creepy wide B-roll shot of them huddled around a campfire at night. A little bit of technical trivia related to that. I read that Robert Eggers did his best to shoot this entire film with available period-appropriate light. So when the characters were inside the house at night, he lit the scene with actual candles. And this campfire shot is another great example of available light. Now, if this were type 1, that would be a big no-no. The campfire shot would have been flat, two-dimensional lighting like a Disney Plus Star Wars show, and it would probably not be in the film anyway. It then transitions into scene 3, and the horrific musical crescendo drops out, and there's a big, wide shot of clouds in the sky. And it is abrupt, and there's very little ground at the bottom of the frame. Now, if you asked 100 people to frame that shot and plot the results on a bell curve, most would aim parallel to the horizon, including a reasonable amount of ground and sky. But you'd have a few incompetent people on the left side and a few geniuses on the right side who would frame it so imbalanced like Robert Eggers did. It's visually dissonant, and our brains might want to pull the camera angle back down, so we're going to call that dissonance number 6. Now, in the language of filmmaking, this would serve as an establishing shot to show where the characters have arrived, but it gives us very little information aside from it's daytime. So if this were type 1, we'd see more of the geography, not just the sky. And then it cuts in a jarring manner to a close-up shot of the dad's face pressed into the ground. And I thought to myself, what the heck is he doing? Sleeping? How unusual. Well, we'll call that dissonance number 7. Now, these shots have all been disorienting, but that's what you get with type 2. Viewing it is an active puzzle for the viewer, or at least it is for me. And it wasn't until the dad stood up and the camera followed him that the previous framing made any sense. And I realized, oh, he's down there praying. The whole family is praying. Okay, then. And there's also no dialogue. The dad doesn't say the prayers out loud. No one is narrating because it's all conveyed visually. They raise their hands, thankful to their deity for this land where they will settle and build a glorious homestead. And that's subtlety number 2. Had this been a type 1, there would have been constant spoken exposition to guarantee that the viewer understands exactly what's happening. It's as if type 1 art only requires us to half pay attention or be half awake and still get it. No creative thought required. And type 2 films let the viewer figure things out on their own. But wait, there's something in the background too. This isn't just about the family. There is another crescendo of creepy chords with choir as the camera pushes in and zooms in on the woods. And cut to black. And there are about 8 seconds of black this time. And that's certainly unusual because that is a long time. And that's dissonance number 8, bordering on dimension 7. And if this were type 1, that wouldn't be allowed. The audience would get confused. Why is the movie over? So those first 3 scenes of The Witch are very type 2. There are many conspicuous camera shots, intense music, and minimal dialogue. In fact, scenes 2 and 3 added up to over 3 minutes with no dialogue at all. Now we're jumping ahead to scene 5, and this is the scene with the baby and the woods. And it begins lightheartedly. Anya Taylor-Joy is playing peekaboo with the baby. And that sets us up for a powerful tonal shift, because Sam, the baby, simply disappears. That's surprise number 3. And this is the first surreal moment of the film. And there's no possible way an infant ran into the woods. But Anya Taylor-Joy screams and runs after him. Now, had this been a type 1, the kid wouldn't have just vanished. Instead, a cackling green witch would have come down on a broom and swiped him up and flown away with him. And the dad would have been there, pulled out a musket, and we'd have an action scene. And he'd yell a very type 1, "Come back here with my child, you witch." But instead, we get ambiguity number 2, because what did happen? Something supernatural? We don't know yet. And in scene 6, after all those slow tension-building scenes, we get some horrific gore. Turns out that the witch stole that baby to make broom flying ointment. Yep, the witch does some bad things in her cottage, and we're not even 10 minutes into the film. Robert Eggers went there explicitly, and man, this scene was super uncomfortable to watch, in my own totally subjective opinion. Definitely Dimension 7, number 2, for me. And I don't think anything else in the film compares to this scene's gross out factor. Now, had it been a type 1, it would have been a long monologue scene, probably with the child locked in a cage as the villain explained her evil plans. So now we're jumping way ahead to the second to last scene, the Black Phillip Live Deliciously scene. And this is a famous scene, spoiler alert, where Black Phillip reveals his true identity to be Satan. As I already mentioned, that was surprise number 2. Not sure why Satan would go through all the trouble to pick on this one destitute family of farmers in the middle of nowhere. But also, why not? And just like the opening scene in this film, we hear a voice. But again, we do not see Black Phillip speaking, only Anya Taylor-Joy reacting to his voice. And it no doubt cut down on production costs because good luck getting a goat to talk. But it's actually a powerful technique, like scenes in 80s movies when the scary stuff is all happening off screen, because it can sometimes be more powerful only to show a character's reaction, leaving some things to the audience's imagination. And here are some examples of that trick from other films. Number 1, Han Solo tortured and screaming on Cloud City in Empire Strikes Back. Number 2, the little kid looking at the aliens in Close Encounters. And number 3, the what's in the box scene from 7. And this scene is also ambiguity number 3, because is the goat really talking to her, or is she losing her mind and imagining it? And what also works well is this. Black Phillip whispers. He speaks so quietly that it's nearly impossible to understand him without subtitles. You would think that Satan would have a powerful voice, but this is a perfect example of ironic counterpoint. So there's ironic counterpoint number 1. And after he whispers, "Dost thou see a book before thee?" we can just barely see a brief shot of the goat's foot stepping into the frame, but the other foot is a man's boot. So maybe she's not imagining all of this. But still, we don't know. But he polymorphs into human form. And in his human form, Black Phillip, or Satan, is barely visible in the dark behind her. It's this theme of occlusion again, things being hidden from the viewer. And these shots are so dark, it's dissonance number 9. Had this been a type 1 film, Satan would have shown up big and loud, maybe even roaring, and then speaking in a clear and deep voice, and there would be fire, and he'd probably even announce who he was and give a big Satan speech. But no, Robert Eggers went for the exact opposite. Now here's a weird detail. I don't know why, but when Satan asks her to sign the deal in his evil book, she says, "I cannot write my name." Now, is she claiming she is illiterate? Is this intentional ambiguity? If you know why she says, "I cannot write my name," leave a comment and let me know. Anyway, Satan responds, "I will guide thy hand." and bang, it hard cuts to the next shot even before the word hand is totally finished. It was a striking Type 2 editing choice, and we'll call it dissonance number 10. And it reminds me of a comedic stylistic technique Adam McKay used all over The Big Short and Vice. The next shot is Anya Taylor-Joy walking naked through the field and into the woods at night, and Black Phillip is following her. The goat version of Black Phillip. And I'd say that's unexpected and possibly surprise number 4. And once again, this is a Type 2. There's no dialogue in the final scene, just Anya Taylor-Joy laughing and floating up into the air. If this were Type 1, another witch would have welcomed her in a typical witchy voice. You are now ready to join our coven. Or is it coven? Feel the power of evil within you. Yes, you are now a witch. And then they'd all put on pointy hats and do some loud cackling as they flew away in front of the full moon on brooms. So this was subtlety number 3. Now, about the symbolism in this scene, I suspect that the witchcraft represents her repressed sexuality because she was at the age of becoming a woman. So by joining the witches, she gained autonomy and power. And she broke free from an oppressive religion and her miserable, controlling family. And that is abstraction number 2. But in the end, we don't know. Was this simply the story of a young woman who went insane and murdered her family? Did she imagine the supernatural elements due to the hallucinogenic fungus? Did she simply run off naked into the woods with a goat at the end and there were no witches? Still part of that big ol' ambiguity number 1. In my own totally subjective opinion, The Witch is my second favorite horror film of all time, knocking Barbarian down 1 spot. So I gave it 5 out of 5 stars and a little heart on Letterboxd. Okay, that's the end of this episode of The Carl King Show. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or anywhere else you consume these dang episodes. And if you like this show, support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Thank you to my little production team, my script editor Chris Higgins, and my transcriptionist Eric Alexander Moore. My Patreon patrons help me also to pay those guys. And a special thank you to my $51 a month patrons at the Illusionist level, Chubode, Sean Motley, and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for joining me. And as I always say, did ye make some unholy bond with that goat?